Thanks for listening to Other People's Flowers. If you'd like to have your work featured on the program, please send it to editor@otherpeoplesflowers.com. We hope you enjoyed this episode.
Those Left Behind by Jonathan Darcy. Seeing your former teachers again is a bit like being half drowned. You don't want to do it, but you know it'll be alright again once you surface. All part of life, all part of getting older. Some fallacy they want to force feed you so you can be normal and mundane like them. I happened upon Brian Darcy on a wet September street in Bloomsbury, or rather, he happened upon me. I was outside my barrister's chambers, gasping for air, having just been told what the pinstripe-suited old Ponce's fees were, when a hand tapped me on my back. Jonathan. I took a second to recognise him. He'd been 26 when he was teaching me Latin and Greek. Now he was balding, greying, with crow's feet around his eyes like tribal war paint. He was older, but recognisable. Mr. Darcy, sir. It was all instinct. Of course I didn't want to call him sir or Mr. Darcy, but once a teacher, always a teacher, and I couldn't call him anything else. Please, call me Brian. We shook hands. How are you? He asked. Fine, I said in my English way, stifling the fact that I was thinking how on earth I was going to pay my barrister's extortionate fees. Are you free now? He asked. Yes. Let me buy you a coffee? Sure. We went to a small cafe full of suited men and women who I assumed could only be money-grabbing barristers and their solicitor cronies. Brian, as I had to continually remind myself to call my old teacher, ordered 2 coffees without asking me what I wanted, and then sat down opposite me. Still teaching? I asked. I tried all this, he gestured at the suited people around. But you know, it just wasn't for me. I always loved teaching. It always gave me a sense of purpose, like I was bringing a generation of people to the surface of life. Poetic. Just as cynical as always, I see. I try my best. You were always a funny one, you know, my brightest pupil, but also my least well-formed. No doubt there were better classicists in the class, no doubt there were better ones when you went to university, but none I ever taught had as much raw potential as you. I always thought it was because you spent too much time trying to be cool. All that smoking. He drew an imaginary cigarette to his mouth. All that time chasing tail. He laughed. I never thought you fulfilled your true potential. So what are you up to? I told him, and he smiled at me like he knew me better than anyone. There had always been something slightly creepy about him when we were studying. What was this 26-year-old doing teaching people? It just didn't seem right. Surely he should be out there living, rather than stifling in a classroom full of adolescents, trying to get them to love Plato and Homer as much as he did. Not to say I didn't appreciate the education he'd given me. It was worth it, but still I felt sorry for him, this man, so excited to see an old pupil after so many years. He must have been in his early 40s then. Still single, I assumed, unmarried, no kids. Just a fervent desire to teach. Or so I assumed. Teaching for Brian had only ever been a stopgap. Graduating from Oxford with his treasured first in classics, he needed something to do while he figured out his future profession. His family had their plans for him, of course. Solicitors, every last one of them, apart from his sister who was a dentist. There was excellence there, but it was too forced, too obvious. No, what he wanted was to define himself outside of his family, be something none of them could ever have been. But then, sitting in the classroom every day teaching dour-faced students about Cicero, Plato and Homer was actually somewhat inspiring. Most of them went through his classes without even registering they were in a classroom. Spotty boys, greasy-haired girls, their parents paying for an education they definitely didn't deserve. All of them probably going to end up failed alcoholics, squandering their family's money. But amongst all these degenerates, there was always 1 or 2 who got through. He remembered the first student he felt got it. They were reading Homer on a bitter cold morning in January, term having just commenced. The classroom was so cold their breath was condensing as they read, and Rufus Townley was translating the Greek for the class. It was the Odyssey 9, and Odysseus and his men were just digging into Polyphemus' stocks of cheese. Sir, said Rufus, breaking off his monotonic translation, is it fair to say this whole episode is a metaphor for the Trojan War? Continue. Well, they win by trickery. Perhaps Homer is saying that they can only ever win by trickery because Odysseus is a deceitful person. Probably not. It was the curiosity, the yearning desire to be more than just a sex-obsessed teen that had captured Brian at that moment. Teaching might have been intended as a stopgap, but it could become a career. So he was off to Yorkshire, to a beautiful valley in the middle of the North York moors for his second job. The students at that school were the worst he'd come across so far. Spoilt, lazy and arrogant, there would be pleasure in seeing them fail in the real world, realising that life extends much further than the border of their valley. There were talented children too. The classics department was much smaller than at his previous school, and the students who studied Latin and Greek were that much more dedicated. Among the Latin teachers was also John Leyden. Darcy would always remember the moment he'd first seen John Leyden, or JL as he affectionately became known, dark-skinned, aged, silver hair, wearing yellow and grey lycra as he rode his bicycle into the car park. Brian was on the way down from his boarding house where he was deputy housemaster. It was October, and the trees were as bare as ice. The sky a mottled grey in the morning half light, and John Leyden riding a bike like he'd just stepped out of the Tour de France. Brian, isn't it? JL stood with the tray in front of him. Mind if I join you? Of course. It was still early, and the refectory was empty other than a few keen students and teachers. Did you cycle far? I live about 18 miles away. Oh. Sorry I haven't gotten to speak to you before. The new academic year is always a busy one. Of course. Brian stirred a plastic-looking egg on his plate. You're younger than I thought you'd be. Youngest classics teacher I've seen for a long time. Why did you decide to become a teacher? Because those who can't do, teach. The voice of his father leaning back on his leather-bound chair, smoking a cigar, that Yorkshire accent tinged with an undercurrent of malice, as if to say, my son, a teacher, what a fucking disappointment. Oh, I love inspiring young people. Gave teaching a try and loved it. Now here I am. Well, you'll do right by us here, Brian, I'm sure. Let's have a beer at the end of the week. Of course. And with that, JL was off, having only taken a sip of his coffee and a slither of his toast. The cycling Yorkshireman didn't need to eat. He only needed to top up his appetite, and he was done and on his way again. Teaching was difficult for the rest of that day. All he could see was JL in his cycling lycra, that silvery grey hair washing all over his face, that tanned skin. But no, must focus on the Homer and the Plato. At first it was easy. Large groups of them would go to the pub in the village after school on a Friday or a Saturday. They'd sit in the garden at the edge of the dry stone wall and admire the undulating valley that twisted below them. In the winter, hoarfrost gripped it every morning. In the summer, cowslip, daisies and buddleia turned the meadowed grass into a paradise for insects and small birds. 3 years he'd watched the winter turn to spring, spring to summer and back again. 3 years of peaceful life in this peaceful valley. Life, JL was saying, but Brian was only concentrating on a small patch of his mercury stubble. Has an annoying habit of creeping up on you. I'll tell you, Brian, 1 minute you're sitting here in your 20s enjoying a cold beer. The next, you're an old man like me, pontificating about how life creeps up on you to a young man like yourself. You're not old, John. I am, Brian. Past 50 is old. I don't go in for any of this nonsense that 60 is the new 30 and all that rubbish. No, I'm old. I feel old. Nothing to be ashamed of. Not much wiser, but certainly creakier. Brian leant on his palm and gazed at JL. There was a man he could appreciate, understand. Not like his father. Not like his dull lawyer brothers. Here was a man who was deserving of his attention. I've not had a bad run, though, Leyden continued. I've done what I loved, and I've lived as I wanted to. But you'll see what happens when you get older. You'll see. They left at 11:30. Everyone else had already gone home. Brian walked with Leyden down the lane back to the school. Leyden had left his car in the car park, a creaking old silver Peugeot that Brian thought suited him perfectly. They were silent on the walk. The moon was out, bright white, lighting the path in blue-grey shadows. A small wind pushed off the top of the valley, ice-cold with the potent Yorkshire spring. When he tried to kiss him, it was all a fumble and a disaster. Leyden was standing next to his car, silver hair glowing in the orange street lamp, talking about a cycle ride he'd done over the Christmas holiday. Brian put his arm around his waist, pushed forward, and all in one movement, thrust his lips to Leyden's. Without hesitating, Leyden shoved him back. What are you doing, you faggot? Leyden tried to correct himself. I didn't mean that, Brian. I'm sorry. I didn't know you felt that way about me. I don't... I don't bat that way, I'm afraid. It was too late. The word had already been said. Was that really what he was, a faggot? Was he even gay? Sexuality had been such a mystery to him up until then. Not a mystery, more a confusion. He'd liked 2 girls at Oxford, both of whom had spurned him, and he'd liked one boy at Cambridge, who he'd never had the courage to try and kiss. And now John Leyden, faggot-hating John Leyden, whose masculinity had just revealed all. "I'm sorry, Brian," he was saying. Brian was looking at the floor, the fine contours of the black tarmac. "I'm sorry, Brian." The words continued to echo. "I've got to go. I'll see you tomorrow." So this was life. He didn't have to quit teaching, but he'd had to do something else. He wanted to believe that the incident with John Leyden hadn't been the turning point, that he'd quit because he wanted more money, because he wanted to have a profession with more chances for making money. The graduate diploma in law was tediously easy. You turned up to the lectures or watched them online, you made a few notes, you discussed the finer points of tort and contract law with disinterested recent graduates, and then you sat an exam that was too easy to revise for. The 9 months in Leeds at BPP passed quickly. Then it was down to London to study for the bar at the University of Law. Being out of Yorkshire took some of the thoughts of dejection out of his mind. Studying made him quickly forget John Leyden and their moment in the car park. London life was a blur. How much was he actually interested in the bar? How much did he care about the finer points of property and tax law? His family were delighted, of course. Every single one of them had congratulated him at Christmas. Each of them coming up to him individually to tell him how proud they were he was joining the family profession. Even with his father's string-pulling, his lack of interest was obvious enough in the pupillage interview that no one was going to assume he'd succeed at the bar. Life at the bar is competitive, tough, and you need a lot of luck. Do you have what it takes, Mr. Darcy? Probably not, was the answer. But instead he nodded his head and assured the pinstripe-suited men that he was more than capable of succeeding if they'd just give him a chance. They didn't. None of them did. So that was that profession over and done with. 2 years of study just to be told he wasn't what barristers' chambers were looking for. But that's life. That's what happens when you try and kiss a greying 50-year-old man in a car park in Yorkshire and he calls you a faggot. You become what you are. You become a hopeless loser whose only talent is failing. Still, he met Persephone while he was studying for the bar, so it wasn't all bad. "You only like me because of my name," she said the 3rd time he slept with her. "You go on and on and on about Persephone and spring and pomegranates, but I don't mind, I like pomegranates." Was this love? It was better than being alone and single, and he was getting older now, 31 next year. He'd be 32 by the time he'd even qualified to practice law. Not that he ever would. Persephone was sweet. She was caring, good-looking, clever, and would make any man very happy. He was lucky she was still kicking around with him. There were better catchers out there. Much better catchers, richer, more successful, better-looking, less socially awkward, but she apparently loved him. "I love you," he said, with the sheets pulled over his chest. A ray of sunlight falling on Persephone's back. "Huh. I love you too, I suppose." And that was enough. They were married in a registry office in Euston Square, with Persephone's pupil master, Ms. Jenkins, as their only witness. It was sufficient. Honeymoon in Brighton and back to London to live in a small flat in Peckham. Life sorted. He applied once more for pupillage, working part-time for the Crown Prosecution Service in the meantime, before deciding that he was not going to make it as a barrister. He was not well connected enough. Persephone's father, a former judge, had sorted her out, and he was not dedicated enough. Heathcote School, a small day school in Kent, offered him a teaching position and he took it. So it was back to teaching. Back to trying to get disingenuous teenagers to nurture a passion for Aristotle, and accepting that not everything went your way in life. Persephone got tenancy, but still wasn't making nearly as much money as they'd expected her to. Brian made nearly as much as her. He'd been promoted at the retirement of the former head of classics and was now heading up the department. More admin, less teaching, more stress. Teaching had never felt stressful until now. He understood what people were going on about when they said teaching was the most stressful profession around. It was a morning in early September. Just before the school year began, he'd spent the summer in London tutoring students for Oxbridge entry. It was fruitless work. give them a few token lines to say in the interview, and hope for the best, because who really knew what went on in that black box process? Nepotism? Perhaps. Perhaps not. It was as closed off as the bar had been to him. Persephone was already up, a cup of coffee steaming in her hand, the first morning light ghosting through the open window. Peckham Rye steamed with dew and the last heat of summer. A few runners darted in between the trees. Dog owners cleaned up after their animals. He sat opposite, with the view of the Rye from the window just out of sight. "I'm pregnant," she said. "Sorry." It took a while to respond, longer than he would have liked, long enough to make her upset. "Sorry? Why would you be sorry? That's fantastic, isn't it?" "I'm not sure we should have it." "What? Why not?" "Do you really think we're ready? I'm only 32. We could wait for another couple of years. Wait until we're more settled." "I'm..." shaking her head. "I couldn't possibly take a year off from the chambers. I'm self-employed. I'd lose all my contacts." "You don't mean you could consider having an abortion?" "What else is there? How far along? Maybe 6 weeks?" "Why didn't you tell me sooner? I didn't know. You can't have an abortion." "We have to have the baby. It's a sin." "Don't bring the Catholic stuff into it." "But it's a sin. You can't end its life. You just can't. I'll look after it. It'll be fine." "You won't have time." "We will. I will. It'll be okay." "It's the end of my career." "No, it's not. It'll be fine." He went over to try and embrace her, but it was awkward and lacked warmth. She moved in his arms and he let her go. "We'll find a way. I promise." Leaving work was out of the question. No way could they pay the mortgage and look after the kid on just Persephone's salary. They needed more. When their son did come screaming out of the womb, the whole fatalistic totality of his commitments came to bear. Persephone smiled at him from the bed. He looked at the little blue-wrapped bundle of flesh and bones and took it in his arms. Did it look like him? Was there a little Brian Darcy in there? Was life going to play the same ironic jokes it had on him as a child? Was it doomed to sit in classrooms, staring at grey walls, looking at teenage minds fail to absorb the beauty of ancient Greek and Latin? "What shall we call him?" Persephone murmured from the bed. They hadn't talked about it at all. They hadn't talked about any of it at all until now. "I don't know. Jason?" "Yes, Jason." So Jason it was. Jason was 4 when Brian started taking an interest in Michael Thompson. He was a small boy, notably shorter than his colleagues, with brown hair that curled around his ears, and the bluest eyes you've ever seen. He was taking Latin and Greek, and once a week Brian would go round to his house to tutor him for the Oxbridge entrance exams. Michael's parents were divorced, and their tutoring sessions would switch between his father's enormous flat in South Kensington and his mother's alimony-bought house in Notting Hill. "I hear your wife's a barrister," said Mr. Thompson when Brian was preparing to leave one evening. "She is." "What sort of law?" "Family. Waste of time. No money in it. You should tell her to go commercial. A couple of friends of mine are in the commercial set, if you want an introduction." "That's kind. I'll let her know." "You think Mike's got a chance at the big two?" "He's a clever and a studious boy, so I expect so." "Well, here's a cheque. See you when I see you." At 17, Michael didn't seem like a child. Sure, his facial hair was more like a light dusting, his skin still had a babyish suppleness, his body was still meagre and expanding, but he acted like an adult. He smoked, he drank. Brian was pretty sure he wasn't a virgin anymore. He was always flirting with the girls in classes and in break times. Brian watched him in the sixth form lounge, flitting amongst different groups. He was capable of chatting to the geeks and hanging with the cool kids, getting the most attractive little nymphettes to follow him around and making the less attractive fall for him. He was handsome. He was cool. He was, certainly for Brian, dangerous. Long nights at home with walking and talking Jason were only tolerable when he shut his eyes and imagined his next meeting with Michael, or remembered how close they got when he was tutoring him. How their forearms had touched as they pored over the declensions of a gerundio. Sometimes their knees touched too, that not fully grown kneecap just bumping into his. It was electric. Persephone had not lost her pregnancy weight. When she was naked, getting dressed in the morning, love handles sagged down around her plain pants. They didn't touch anymore. There were little kisses at night and in the morning, an occasional cuddle on a Sunday, but it was mostly all a formality, a farce. The sort of marriage Persephone spent her life litigating over. Divorces. She was surrounded by them. Surely it was on her mind. How much longer could she put up with his indifference? He couldn't mask it anymore. It was all about Michael, young, supple Michael. Michael cuddling him at night. Not Persephone's flabby arms, but Michael's strong limbs. Him cooking breakfast for beautiful Michael in the morning. Michael. When it did happen, it was anticlimactic. He was tutoring Michael after school one evening. For the first time, Michael's mother had asked if he could stay late and do the tutoring at school rather than doing it at home. Brian agreed, and so they were sitting in his classroom, the sun already set, Michaelmas term well and truly underway. They were closing. Michael was translating some of Caesar's Gallic War. In the end, it is impossible not to become the thing others think you are, stuttered Michael. And a more fluid translation? Maybe, in the end, it's impossible not to become what others think you are. Thing is a little coarse, I think. Yes, it really is impossible, he thought. Michael's long hair drifted around his forehead, dropping off to just above his eyebrows. Brian reached out, put his hand to the flapping mop, and brushed it to the left. Michael looked up, eyes twisted and confused. Was there desire in there? And Brian kissed him on the lips. A soft peck, nothing more. Then, all passion looming, he took his head and pressed his soft lips with months of pent-up desire. 30 seconds, a minute, who knew how long until he pulled away. Michael looked at him, somewhat bewildered. "I'm sorry," said Brian. "I'm sorry." "It's okay," said Michael. "I liked it." Sexual encounters was the charge. Michael wasn't pressing, but it meant immediate dismissal from his teaching position. Criminal charges would follow, if any. There had been a whole slew of awkward conversations with people asking him why he'd done it. What sort of a villain misled a child? What kind of a monster would take advantage of someone who looked up to him so? What will your wife say? How will you break this to your young son? How will you break this to your young son? It's about your fucking dick, isn't it? Persephone certainly gave the best response. None of them mentioned that Michael was over 18 and thus consenting. None of them mentioned that after he'd been dismissed, there were no further charges. That was it. Michael was homosexual and consenting. Nothing else to it. But the torrent wouldn't disappear. 6 months and they were divorced. 7 and he was homeless, spending alternate nights at his brother's flat in Bloomsbury and sleeping in his car. 9 before he lost all custody of Jason. Another 15 until he managed to wrangle some visiting rights. All in the name of what? Ignominy. Unemployment. Hours spent in the offices of barristers having awkward conversations about why he hadn't ever practiced after finishing his BPTC. Enough. Eventually he found work doing gardening for Camden Council. He and a few others would go round the grey gardens in the middle of estates and tower blocks and mow the lawn and trim the shrubs and while away the hours until they could go home. It wasn't much of a life, but it was something. It wasn't for me, Law. I knew that when I started. No point doing something you don't love. I'd finished my coffee, and now all that remained of it was a little brown puddle in the middle of the mug and the trace lines of coffee granules running down the near side. I looked up, awake again. "What do you think?" I hadn't heard a word of what it was I was supposed to be thinking about. "I don't know." Mr. Darcy shuffled in his seat and checked his watch. "Wow, a whole hour." He muttered something else I didn't catch. "I've got to run. Give me your email and we'll do something." I scribbled it down. "I'll get this," I said, as he was counting a bunch of change in his hand. He nodded his appreciation. "You know," he said, as he was putting his coat on, "it's funny how much you've grown up. I mean, you're a man now. Last time I saw you, you were just a child." I smiled, slightly unconvinced by the comment. "I didn't mean to patronise. Don't worry. It's fine. It's just life catches up with you. Try not to be one of those who gets left behind." And he was gone, cold October air streaming through the open door.
Other People's Flowers was produced by Hugo Gibson, Chris Camon Vutitam, and Hamish Adam Cairns. If you'd like to have your work featured on the show, please send it to editor@otherpeoplesflowers.com. Thank you for listening.